My name is Persis Bekkering, and I'll be talking to author Julia Phillips tonight. So Julia Phillips wrote her debut novel, Disappearing Earth, Verdwijnende Aarde in Dutch, which was first published in May 2019, and the Dutch translation just came out. Julia Phillips will be zooming in with us from Brooklyn. Disappearing Earth is set in the far east of Russia on the peninsula of Kamchatka. The novel follows the lives of several women after the disappearance of two sisters. Some of the women are closer related to the sisters, others are more removed, but what counts is that time passes and gradually no one believes anymore that the sisters will be found and that the crime will be solved. The novel was an international bestseller, it still is, and it was welcomed by raving reviews and unanimously praised. So I'm really, really happy to talk to you tonight, Julia. I loved your book. I loved the very precise prose, the beautiful descriptions of the landscapes and the tenderness also in the story. So thank you for being here. I love your raven. We've asked every author to put a raven in the background, and I see you've found something on your shelves.
Yes, I've tried to prominently display it. It's so wonderful to be here with you virtually. I wish I could be with you in real life in The Hague, but it's just wonderful to get to connect in this way. And I have my raven here. True confession, it's a crow, I believe.
It's a crow.
Yeah, but it's a wonderful book called Hollow Kingdom by Jane Buxton. So I recommend the book and the bird.
So doing some publicity here.
Yeah.
Very nice. So Julia, I mean, I would love to talk to you about your book, but I'm sure today you've had other things on your mind with the American elections. We're all following it closely, also here in the Netherlands. I found it hard to concentrate today because I was just kept checking the live stream. How are you doing there?
I think we're all in limbo a bit. I feel that the past 4 years have been quite challenging as a nation and personally and around the world. And this year has been quite challenging in all of those aspects. And so, to be honest, it's hard to feel new anxieties now over the election when things have been so terrible for so long. Yeah. That's not the optimistic response, I know, but that is the truth. I look forward to hopefully more certainty, but there's certainly a lot of work ahead to do to make a better world.
Yeah. How is the situation now in Brooklyn? I mean, here we're back into a semi or not, I don't know, like a lockdown, whatever you want to call it. Life is a bit more lax now in Brooklyn, right?
It is, and our case numbers are rising here and in the surrounding region and throughout the country, less here than they are in other parts of the country because we were hit so badly in the beginning, I think. But I think we're gearing up for quite a challenging, I keep saying challenging to mean terrible, quite a terrible winter here. But my fingers are crossed. You're speaking to me, unfortunately, not at an optimistic moment about the state of my nation. But I hope things get better soon. But yeah, I don't think, I keep thinking that we'll also re-enter a lockdown here, and that is not happening. And I think our leadership very much does not want that to happen. So let's see. Let's see. I think you're hearing some sirens outside. Speaking of how things are in Brooklyn, you might be getting a little street noise.
Oh, well, actually, now that you're mentioning it, can the sound be a bit louder here on my right? Because I find it hard to really hear you.
Oh, no.
I also just wanted to say just two things that I forgot to say, that to everyone who tuned in, if you have questions, do not hesitate to put them in the chat box. Questions for you, Julia, or just if you're struggling with technical stuff. Het mag ook in het Nederlands. And besides that, if you appreciate the festival and if you enjoy our conversation, we would be very grateful if you could make a donation to support the festival. We can use your donation. But feel free, otherwise this whole conversation and this whole night will be free. So, Julia, the most obvious question, of course, to ask about your book is about the location. It's set in Kamchatka, a very vast territory, but also unknown to many of us and very remote. So I'm curious, why did you decide to situate a book there?
That's a good question. I came to Kamchatka through Russian studies. I was a student of Russian at university, Russian and writing, and had spent some time as a student in Western Russia, in and around Moscow, and really loved the country and loved studying the language and the literature and the history, and wanted to keep studying it. So I thought, well, if I had always wanted to be a writer, and I still wanted to be a writer, I thought if I set a novel in Russia, then I'll get to move to the country, research the book, and sort of, scratch all these itches at once. I get to do everything that I want at the same time. So I started looking around for a place to move. And when I looked and found about Kamchatka, learned about Kamchatka, it absolutely blew my mind with how beautiful and complicated and rich and fascinating I found it, and how much it seemed to suggest a million different stories that could be written about this wonderful place. And so that's what brought me there. I went to Kamchatka for the first time in 2011.
And was it the landscape or the culture or the people you met? What was it that fascinated you so much?
I think the first thing that fascinated me from the very start, a lot of my entry into Russian studies and my sort of origin story as a Russophile is, as an American, a fascination with the Soviet, post-Soviet transition or the Cold War period. As an American, so much of the America I know, I've come to understand as one developed in relationship with the Soviet Union or in relationship with Russia, with Russianness, with the idea of Russianness or Sovietness. And a lot of the things that when I was growing up I thought were distinctively American traits created in isolation, I came to understand them more as traits that are developed out of a relationship and in dialogue with this other nation. And so I was drawn to Kamchatka because of that Cold War Soviet history and significance and that post-Soviet transition. Kamchatka is a kind of microcosm of the dynamics that were in place throughout the larger Soviet Union and throughout contemporary Russia, at least in my eyes. I'm sure lots of folks have different opinions on that. But in my eyes, it's a bit of a microcosm where during the Soviet Union, it was intensely isolated. As you said, it's a huge area. It's the size of Italy. It's quite big. But it was closed to all foreigners and to most Russians. You had to have special permission as a Soviet citizen to visit there because it was a highly significant Soviet military base. And it really loomed large in the sort of Cold War imagination of the potential havoc it could wreak because it was so close to so many other countries. It's right on the Pacific coast near Alaska for Americans. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the economy there completely changed. The sense of significance or purpose that had been present in the 20th century really shifted a lot. And a lot of folks are still figuring out what happens next or what the future looks like for Kamchatka. And all of those things were really fascinating to me. As an American, I thought maybe that's a great entry point for me to learn about this specific part of the world. I will say also, you mentioned landscape. It's very, very, very beautiful. The most beautiful place I've ever been. And I think having all that fascinating history set in this volcanic landscape, this geography, really fascinated me.
It's interesting what you say that Americanness is like constructed as against the Soviet Union during the course of the Cold War. So would you say what you found there was something like like the opposite of Americanness?
I think what I found there at the time I was there, I conceived of as a kind of sibling relationship to Americanness, in the way that, or two sides of the same coin. I have a sibling, and there's only the two of us. Like, we don't have any other siblings, and so we create these rules for ourselves, where we say, you're the smart one, you're the funny one, you're the, rebellious one. We sort of assign these things. Oh, if you're the smart one, then I can't be smart. If you're rebellious, then I can't be rebellious. But we're raised in the same family and under the same conditions, and we're much more similar than we are different, even though we try to sort of develop in opposition to each other. We would never, we're siblings to nobody else. We are very, very similar to each other. And I thought of Russia and the US in that way too, that, the American narrative during the 20th century especially was so much like, we are freedom, they are oppression, we are, a light, and they are the darkness, the darkness behind the wall. And yet that narrative is repeated and mirrored in the Soviet Union, or was, and is very similar to each other, and does not reflect the truth of the matter necessarily. I think the United States and Russia, contemporary Russia, are very, very similar to each other in the way that they engage with the world and think of their position in the world, think of their sphere of influence, desire a sort of aggressive power or superiority, or use militarization and violence to enact national agendas. They're similar in those ways, in many ways, in my eyes. That being said, when I was in Kamchatka in 2011, 2012, and 2015, I did not know about the relationship I know about now when it comes to how that political influence is used, how that, what kind of vision contemporary leadership has for their place in the global sort of relationships and dialogue, conversation, I should say. And I don't see Russia and the US as similar as I did then. And I also see our relationship as much closer now, much more intermingled now, in a way that I didn't understand then. And in a way that, on this post-election day occasion, I would say I would wish for a little more distance between these two siblings in this relationship.
Yeah. So you mean the way Russia has influenced the 2016 elections, for example, and we don't know the extent to which they're doing it now, but that they're much more intermingled than you thought.
Yes, and that my conception is Russian leadership has a much more, they have a better sense of what that relationship is than American leadership does, at least in the presentation of that relationship to the public. My sense is that the American leadership that we've had recently doesn't quite understand or convey to the public an understanding of what that dynamic is, whereas I think Russian leadership does. That's my impression. However, I don't know what's going on behind the walls of leadership. And I was very glad to get to go to Kamchatka and not be in the center of power, or trying to see inside the Kremlin, or trying to see inside the White House here in the US, but to write about and think about people's lives in everyday conditions, whether in Kamchatka or in Moscow or in Brooklyn, where I am, or in The Hague, to think about what is specific to the places we are, and also what is similar for all of us around the world.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, your novel doesn't really discuss politics. I mean, of course, in the background, politics is always there, but you're looking very closely up to the lives of its inhabitants, mostly women. I was wondering, to what extent is the world of Kamchatka that you construct in your book a mirror of America? And then I don't mean politics, but its social structures, its problems. Like, for example, one of the things that struck me was the racial divide in your novel is as much there as it is in America, for example, between white people and indigenous. There are these different layers of like white people, the Russians versus indigenous people, and also foreigners, the fear of foreigners. But then the foreigners are Uzbeks or whatever. So yeah, how do you see these as a mirror? How do you see Kamchatka as a mirror of American society?
I think I love to think about this because it's an opportunity for me, and I'm really glad you asked this. It's an opportunity for me to reflect on what I saw there and what, or took from there, and what is reality there. My perception as an American, the filter I have as an American, or bias I have as an American, is very strong. And I learned while I was in Kamchatka, not able to be removed. A lot of times, the best I can do is notice that it's there, but many times I don't notice that it's there, and it shapes the way I perceive reality. And so on Kamchatka, my perception was that this is a place there are dynamics in place on this peninsula that really echo the U.S. Russia is a much older nation that was colonized by Slavs over centuries. And Kamchatka was quite late to be colonized. It was colonized in the 1600s, 1700s. Europeans were arriving there. Eur-Asians were arriving there. And Kamchatka had people already living there for almost 20,000 years. Indigenous Kamchatkans, as you mentioned, there are indigenous Siberians that came from elsewhere in the Russian continent to the Kamchatka Peninsula. And there are many different people there with many different histories and cultures and conceptions of how things work. And at this point, the ethnically Russian population, the Slavic population, is the vast majority and of residents of the peninsula, and also holds, even as a majority, holds a disproportionate amount of power and wealth on the peninsula. That history of colonization, of invasion, of concentration of power in a racial or ethnic majority seems to me to be really resonant of dynamics in the United States. And it was one that I really wanted to better understand there in order to better understand myself and my own home. But it's always a question, I think, of do we see those things because we're looking for them? Do we see my understanding of whiteness is hugely American and fundamental to my understanding of the world. Whiteness, I say, in terms as a white person, as a white American, and my whole understanding of the world is contingent on race. That's, as an American, that's how we interact and see things and have developed our history. And it's a powerful and guiding sort of viewpoint that I couldn't take off. And so you named a perfect example of that in the book. The book, Kamchatka, I think, in reality, as in the book, has divides of power. It has hierarchies, ethnic hierarchies. It has an ethnic majority that has colonized the place. And yet the assigning of that dynamic with the labels, white, or with the assignment of race across that. That is a perception of mine, and not I think a way of seeing the dynamics in place that is Kamchatkan or Russian. It certainly isn't part of the Russian language or everyday language to say this is a white person. They would say this is an ethnic Russian person. That conception is one that I use in my own mind, and certainly used in the book, to make sense for myself of what I was seeing.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting to me to think, it is what I was making sense of. How much of that did I bring with me? I think a lot. And also I think it's there too. I think all the places I've been in the world have in-groups and out-groups, and certainly in the American context, racially divided hierarchies.
So in Kamchatka, one wouldn't refer to themselves or to others as white. They would say Russian, or do they even talk about these divides?
Yeah. I was really grateful to talk with a lot of people about these divides. And I'm very, my perception of the Netherlands is that it might be somewhat similar. In America, folks don't talk forthrightly about race very often, especially white people don't talk about race very much. I have the impression, I don't know if this is true, so correct me if I'm wrong, or tell me if I'm right, that in the Netherlands, people are maybe a bit more straightforward. I don't know if that's the case. In Russia, people are very, in my limited experience, very, very, very straightforward about they tell you what they think when they think it, at least in sort of a surface level, or a more, in small talk is more honest, or you'll have a conversation with a stranger that is more honest or more forthright than,
or blunt.
more blunt.
I would
yes.
say in general, Dutch people can be pretty straightforward.
Yes, yeah, blunt is the perfect way to say it. And so I was really glad to get to talk to a lot of folks about their perceptions of their home of Kamchatka, and how they see it, and how they see their neighbors or themselves. There's a word in Russian for ethnic Russian, and there's a word in Russian for kind of Russian citizen, or like, person who lives in Russia. And that division was an often discussed one. There's also a very, very commonly used pair of words, meaning like ours and theirs, or, us and them. And that was one that, as a foreigner myself, I encountered all the time, the idea that there's us and there's them. And the us was fascinating to me because it was one that was saw itself as native to the peninsula, and was a relatively recent arrival to the peninsula.
Yeah.
And the folks who were indigenous there were often seen as them, or as outsiders.
So you just lived there for a while, or like, what did you do? What did your research trajectory look like? How to imagine?
It was the best thing that ever happened to me, getting to go there. I got a grant to a fellowship, a writing fellowship, to go to Kamchatka, and it gave me visa support to live there for a year, and helped set me up as part of the university, and really sort of gave me a lot of practical support to do what research I was going to do. And I couldn't believe I had sort of tricked this fellowship granting organization into giving me this fellowship, because what does writing research look like? There were other people who had this fellowship who were researching tuberculosis in different hospitals, like quite robust and structured research. So the way I decided my research would be is that I would say I wanted to meet as many people as possible. I wanted to go as many places as possible, and I wanted to do as many things as possible. I wanted to just say yes to everything all the time. And then I took notes and pictures and recordings of whatever it was. So I really quite aggressively tried to talk to anyone who would talk to me, or go wherever I could, or chase whatever opportunities came along, even if they seemed quite out of my depth or unlikely or challenging. I just went all in on it, and it ended up being, I think, very, very helpful, that approach, and one that I would like to practice, using more often.
I can imagine that pretty quickly everyone knew about the American on the peninsula.
Yes. Yes, everyone. Kamchatka is open now to outsiders, but it's still very challenging to reach. Just practically, it doesn't have any roads that connect it to the mainland. You have to reach it by air or by sea, and it's difficult and expensive to get to. And so when I went, I think there were a dozen Americans kind of living long term on the peninsula that I knew of. There was one family of about 6 people, and then a couple other Americans, and then there was me. And we stuck out like sore thumbs. We were very noticeable.
Yeah, and I came across a reportage you wrote about reindeer hunting. So you've been really you've been getting involved in all sorts of communities, I see.
Yeah, in 2015, when I went for my second trip there, I really wanted to spend as much time as possible outside of the capital city of the region, which is where about half the population of Kamchatka lives, in this one place. I wanted to spend some time in central Kamchatka and in more rural areas. And I had the incredible fortune of getting to spend some time living with a group of reindeer herders as they moved their herd of reindeer around the tundra in central Kamchatka. And that was an absolutely life-shaping experience, to get to learn, to get to be with people as they live and work. It's folks are living nomadically with the herd and are working in shifts every single day, but constantly every day you're not going to take a day off. Like this is a constant lifestyle. And so the generosity of these herders to fold me into their routine and show me their work and talk to me about their thoughts and their lives and show me this landscape was unbelievable to me, and really opened my eyes to how generous people can be.
Wow. Did you bring an interpreter, or how did it go?
No, I didn't bring an interpreter. We spoke Russian together. I have a very, there are folks there who spoke, the group I was with was mostly Aven, which is a indigenous Siberian, native Siberian group of people. So there are folks there who spoke Aven, but mostly spoke, the main conversation was in Russian all the time. I have a very heavy American accent in my Russian. And so there were some folks there who could understand me when I spoke, and some folks who, said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand your heavy accent." And that has been the case I've lived in Russia about 2 years, and I spent about a decade studying Russian, and that has been the case for me always. It's unfortunately not there. I carry that obstacle with me.
Yeah. So just a little reminder for those of you who tune in with this conversation, you can drop questions for Julia at all times. There's someone looking in their chat box, Megan, my colleague, and I see the questions here on the screen if there are any. So maybe I get to ask your question to Julia. So in the novel, it starts off with the disappearance of 2 sisters. And everyone is really confused and upset because this never happens in Kamchatka, they say, or it doesn't go unnoticed because, as you said, you can't really leave the island by car or anything, only by plane or boat. So yeah, I'm interested in why you chose for this kind of story, because it starts off almost as this literary thriller or a crime novel. It becomes something very different, but can you elaborate a bit on the choice for this plot twist?
I would love to. I would love to. I'm very literary thrillers are my favorite genre. I'm a big fan of literary thrillers, of thrillers in general, and certainly have always been fascinated by and compelled by stories of women or girls in peril. That specific kind of missing person story. It is fascinating to me. And after a while of being fascinated by it and being sort of terrified by it and listening to true crime podcasts and reading true crime books and reading all these thrillers and watching detective TV shows and movies, I start to think, well, what is it about this story that is so, why do I have this appetite over and over again to eat the same thing? What is going on here? And when I went to Kamchatka, only knowing that I wanted to write a novel about that place, but not knowing what it would consist of, I expected to find some plot that was very, very far from, these obsessions I had carried with me my whole life. And when I got there, found that, in fact, those stories and obsessions were stronger than ever, that I was going there as this, young white woman and with no knowledge of where, I had kind of no personal network there, no safety structures there. And I found myself thinking all the time of vulnerability and of danger in the kind of stories that I had heard growing up of, abduction by a stranger, or these things that are so extraordinarily rare statistically in any place, let alone Kamchatka, but that are so captivating to the media and to us as consumers. And so those ideas were in my mind. And so I wanted the book to be about that, but to also try to interrogate that and to ask if we broaden the focus from, victim, perpetrator, detective, and look at a community of people, what are the dynamics in place that not only allow this violence to happen, but also encourage and make possible this violence, and what violences are unseen or ignored or put aside that also, facilitate these newsworthy events. I wanted the book to be about that, to have a broader scope, to look at an entire community that works together to hurt each other and then can also work together to help each other.
Yeah. Nancy asks, why are you so interested in Russia and why did you want to study Russian?
I had, when I was in summer camp at 12 years old, I had a crush on a Russian-American camp counselor I had, which is, I wish there was a really elegant answer. Like I read War and Peace and it just really made me want to be a writer. I did read War and Peace and it did make me want to be a writer, but it started for me because I was at this very influential age and met someone who spoke Russian and just thought it was the coolest and most exciting thing I'd ever heard in my life.
Beautiful. I love that. I just wanted to latch on to what you just said about the disappearance story, because the disappearance of the girls has manifold effects on the community, as you describe it in the novel. I also saw some kind of meta level to that, because, this disappearance resonates in the lives of those characters, not literally, but just it's always in the background and it gives them fear or it makes them change their life choices or sometimes in very subtle ways. And we as a reader, we also get to read about the disappearance of two sisters. To hear about a story about the disappearance of girls and the vulnerability of women in a community, it also resonates in us, right? And not only in the characters in the book. So how do you see this? Have you felt a particular responsibility as an author, or should a writer be completely liberated of any responsibility towards its readers and the effects?
I don't think a writer should be completely liberated of any responsibility to their readers. And in fact, I think part of for me, part of the purpose of art or part of what makes art is that it has a moral argument. It has something it wants to say about the way the world is or the way the world should be, that is trying to communicate to somebody else an idea about the state in which we live. And because of that, it seems to me it can't be amoral or entirely detached or sort of just like a play just for fun, or a game to play with readers that is not intended to convey something to them. That's my particular feeling. But so in writing about this disappearance, this fictional disappearance, I think that for me, the process of writing it is a mix of, I was going to say exploitation, or there's, it uses the hook of the girls to compel the narrative and compel the characters and hopefully compel the readers. And in that exact way, we're kind of playing in the background and exciting us and titillating us. And I hope it also makes the argument that we are not, none of us are disconnected from or passive consumers of such stories of violence, that we make those stories happen, and that we use them to maintain our positions or maintain the hierarchies in which we live. And because we have that power, we don't just receive it, like we, as you say, like we use them for this purpose to make us afraid or to shape our decisions, or to, I think often in my experience of reading or watching stories of women in peril, women and girls in peril, I use it to say, oh, that has not, like, I'm safe, they're in danger. This fictional person is hurting, but it's actually fun to watch or read because I'm totally okay. That division, or that idea that, if I don't know this person personally, then it has actually nothing to do with me. And I am not at all complicit in creating the conditions that led to their harm, or I have no role in creating a world in which such harm doesn't happen. That's not true. All the characters, as you say, like no matter how closely or distantly connected, are working together to let the perpetrator, to encourage the perpetrator to do what he does, or to point out, this is who you can hurt and it will not be noticed. This is who you can hurt and it will be noticed. Or to work together to try to make things better, to try to bring attention to what's going on.
Yeah, thanks. Last question already. It's a question from Nick. Nick says, I love the book, Julia, thank you. I'm interested if you know what the reception in Kamchatka was of the book, and if you maybe have recommendations of other novels about Kamchatka.
Oh, that's a great question. I have been very glad and grateful that folks from Kamchatka and from around Russia have read the book and reached out to me. Right now, the book is not yet out in Russian. So the only people who have read it yet, I hope it'll be out in Russian soon. I just saw the Russian cover a couple months ago and it was absolutely gorgeous. The only people who have read it are folks who have read it in a second language. And because of that, they're often folks who are quite invested in the project, or people in Kamchatka, for example, who helped me with my research from the very first days. And at this point, read it and they say, like, okay, Julia, like you wrote it good. That's the feedback. Like you wrote it, good job. You did the thing that you said you were coming here to do. They're sort of the pump is primed for them to have a positive response. But in that context of it not having a Russian edition yet, there are also folks who read it who don't know me, and who have engaged with it as just a book, and not as something that their friend wrote, and who have responded to it with, to me, a really shocking amount of warmth and kindness and I don't know, love, if that's a funny thing to say about the relationship of a reader to a book, or a reader to an author. And also, who say, you know, on page 55, you said that the, you know, doctor knocks on the door before entering the hospital room, but a Russian doctor would never knock on the door before entering, you know, they're like who don't let me stop learning or stop being challenged to notice my biases and notice my assumptions and try to make a better product. So the reception has been really extraordinarily gratifying. I wrote this book to learn about, as a way to keep learning about Russian. And now that it's out, I get to keep learning more and more and more. And that makes me really, really happy.
Wow, that's great. And yeah, the second part of the question was if you have any recommendation of another novel about Kamchatka. Are there, except in Russian language? Some of the books I think about, there's a book called Kamchatka that came out a couple years ago that I believe was set in Argentina. And there's a story about Kamchatka in a book by Tobias Wolff. So the Kamchatka, in my experience of it, in at least sort of American literature of the Americas, is often used as a symbol of a very distant place. And I haven't found other books in English that are set in Kamchatka. But maybe I'm overlooking them. I'm going to keep on looking because it's a place I love to read about. Yeah. It's really wonderful. This is quite different. But in researching this book and thinking about what books I admire or want Disappearing Earth to be like, as I was working on the manuscript, I would read work that was set in Canada and in Alaska, because it was often English language work that grapples with some of the same dynamics. And there's a wonderful book, a nonfiction book called Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Talaga, who's a Canadian journalist and writer that I would recommend very, very, very highly as a kind of role model for writing about place and ethnic dynamics. Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. Unfortunately, we have to round up because there's a full program here, our night at Crossing Border Festival. Thanks for talking to us, and good luck writing in not so locked down anymore Brooklyn. And I wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
So Julia Phillips' Verdwijnende Aarde or Disappearing Earth is available now in our bookstores.